Hello, I'm Lucy Temple-Smith, Senior Advocacy and Communications Advisor at the Global CCS Institute. Welcome to this webinar from the Global CCS Institute, keeping you up to date with learning from experts across the CCS chain. I'd like to give a big welcome to our international audience. We have attendees from around the globe. During this webinar, my colleagues Chris Consoli and Ian Havercroft will be discussing the question, is the world ready for carbon capture and storage? In doing this, they will be drawing on the findings of our recent publication, the CCS Readiness Index, and supporting indicator reports, which are available to download at globalccsinstitute.com. All attendees are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation through the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Questions will be moderated and posed at the end of the presentation. Please be aware that we may not be able to get through all questions today. However, we will endeavour to get through as many as possible in this session. And now let's begin.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Hello from everyone around the world. I'm delighted to introduce the 2018 edition of the Global CCS Institute CCS Readiness Index. My name is Chris Consoli. I'm the Senior Consultant here at the Global Institute. And as Lucy said, I'm joined here with my colleague, Ian Havercroft, Senior Consultant for Law and Regulation.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And thank you to the many people joining us today from around the world. During this webinar, we're going to take you through the findings of the Global CCS Readiness Index that Chris and I worked on and published earlier this month.
Yeah, we hope you've had the chance to download the reports. If not, please listen through this webinar and you'll have the chance after.
In the first part of this conversation, we will discuss the trends we are seeing in the index in late 2018.
In particular, we're going to focus on the rise of the leaders in CCS deployment, but we're also going to identify those emerging regions which are really primed for CCS.
And finally, we're going to look at some of the nations where there has been less activity and the impacts this may have upon carbon capture and storage and climate change more broadly. We'll also look at the history of the deployment of CCS facilities in relation to the index.
We hope you enjoy this webinar.
So let's start by looking at our first set of slides on the CCS Readiness Index.
So we completed the first CCS Readiness Index in 2015 and it was published in 2016. It was really a way to bring together all of our data sets and over a decade of knowledge and experience. The idea is that we want to identify countries primed for CCS deployment and where we really needed more work. Now, the strength of the CCS Readiness Index is it actually comprises 4 separate and very different indicators, all critical to CCS deployment. And those areas are policy, law and regulation, storage, and inherent interest.
Yeah, the 2018 index ranks over 50 countries, and the index identifies leaders, fast followers, and those countries that have yet to fully address the full value of CCS. A further strength of the index is that we undertake this analysis every 2 years, which allows us to track a nation's progress over time. In the next half an hour or so, we're going to go through each of these indicators. So we'll move to the first of the indicators this evening, and this is the inherent interest indicator. We here at the Institute see it as the key indicator for determining the necessity of CCS in a particular country. Using this indicator, we can rapidly identify nations where CCS could play a significant role, not only in terms of emissions reductions, but also where it may support economic development.
Yeah, we really like this indicator for its simplicity, as it tracks the global share of production and consumption. And what that means is it's inherent to emissions, as well as fossil fuel intensity and their fossil fuel exports. Because of this, it clearly highlights the countries that require CCS.
So essentially, if you're a big consumer or exporter of fossil fuels, including for your domestic industries, you will likely rank highly in this indicator.
And so it's unsurprising that you see those countries in the graph on your right are at the top of the list. USA, Russia, China, they all score highly. In fact, in the top 10 are all the major producers and consumers of fossil fuels. We also are introducing the inherent CCS indicator first because the following 3 indicators all use it as a point of comparison.
Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look first at the CCS policy indicator, or as we call it, the CCS PI. This tracks the development of government policies which may accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, particularly those policy measures and policy settings that support a business case for investment in CCS.
So basically a higher score here can indicate a more developed policy environment. The chart on the slide shows the policy indicator against the inherent interest indicator on the y-axis that we introduced before. Now, in a perfect world, what we should see is that countries with a high inherent interest score should also have the highest CCS policy indicator score, which is clearly not the case. Because this would mean that they have actively developed progressive policies to deploy CCS to reduce their emissions from their fossil fuel intensive industries, consumption and production.
And now we see in this slide, in the areas highlighted, 6 nations that have established themselves as clear leaders in CCS policy development and subsequently fall into the Band A category, which is highlighted in the box on the right of your screen. Our review of these nations' policies suggests that they have established very strong institutional frameworks and created broader supporting policies that are essentially stimulating CCS activity in that particular nation. This in turn will likely continue to build confidence in the business case for investment in CCS. And another feature of these particular countries is that in some instances they have experience in deploying a CCS facility.
So the second box there, you see Band B nations in the middle. And all of these nations have implemented policy initiatives designed to facilitate CCS. However, according to our review at least, their portfolio of policies is generally less comprehensive, and the business case for investment in a large-scale facility in Band B nations is perhaps less well developed. Now, it's important to mention at this point that all the Band B nations have supported notable CCS demonstration projects and research activities, or at least research activities, and their governments have adopted favourable stances towards CCS.
The policy response of nations outside of those included within bands A and B are perhaps less mature, with little or no real effective policy to incentivize emissions reduction through CCS. It is notable, however, that within this group, 3 nations do have operating large-scale CCS facilities, and those are Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Brazil. In these cases, CO2 utilized for enhanced oil recovery has allowed state-owned enterprises to invest in CCS without the broad range of policy measures that are generally required in other jurisdictions to incentivize private sector investment.
Yeah, and the final box on the screen there with the exclamation mark highlights Russia, India, Indonesia, and Germany. These nations' economies are very dependent upon fossil fuels, as indicated by their high inherent interest score. And it could be suggested that CCS can play a major role in the decarbonisation of these countries' economies and be key, and CCS could be key to deployment area. And therefore they need the supportive policy environment to reduce emissions. And according to our analysis at least, that's not currently in place.
If we move now on to the next slide, and our next indicator, and this is the CCS Legal and Regulatory Indicator, again the acronym we use, the CCS LRI. Now the LRI offers a very detailed examination and assessment of CCS specific legal and regulatory frameworks across 55 countries. Our methodology enables us to track the progress of legal and regulatory developments, and as well it allows us to identify gaps and opportunities across the many jurisdictions considered. The LRI considers those factors that are likely to be critical for the regulation of the technology across or throughout the project lifecycle. It focuses upon administrative and permitting arrangements, issues related to environmental assessments, public consultation, long-term liability, to name a few. And in all, there are 29 factors as part of the assessment, and these are considered as part of 5 overarching assessment criteria.
So it's quite a robust and rigorous assessment of countries' legal and regulatory frameworks. And comparable to the policy indicator, the results of the 2018 legal and regulatory indicator are displayed as a single score for each country, which you can see on the screen. And once again, these countries we compare to the inherent interests.
So essentially what you see here is an assessment of the comprehensiveness or perhaps maturity of a nation's CCS-specific regulatory regime. Higher scores obviously indicating, in this particular instance, more developed CCS-specific regimes. In the boxes now, the first box that's popped up, you can see that 4 nations have established CCS-specific laws that are applicable across most parts of the CCS project lifecycle. And these nations are Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, USA, and Denmark. They largely provide comprehensive CCS-specific models that address many of the novel aspects of the technology. The majority of countries, however, as you can see from this chart, have limited or very few CCS-specific or existing laws which are applicable across aspects of the CCS project lifecycle. Now, while this is demonstrative of perhaps of the significant opportunities for improvement worldwide, it is also perhaps of particular concern for those countries where there are strong policy commitments to deployment.
Yeah, at one point I can add to this discussion on the legal and regulatory indicator is that when we compared it to the 2015 results, the 2018 results have largely unchanged for each country. And I guess this means in terms of regulation, there has not been that much progress over the 2 years. Is that right, Ian?
Yep, Chris, that's correct. We've seen very few changes between 2015 and 2018. And there are likely a host of reasons for this if you consider each individual country on its own. But taking a high-level approach, I think most likely is the lack of new projects in the pipeline, the absence of clear policy support for the technology in some jurisdictions. And I think it would be fair to say this has effectively resulted in law and regulation specifically for CCS perhaps stalling. A perhaps less positive observation, particularly when we consider how important a role law and regulation will play in supporting deployment.
Yeah, you need your regulations in place to enable deployment. Thanks for that, Ian. And once again, to reiterate, you can get more information about the methodologies and the results from our website on that specific indicator. Now, moving on to the next indicator for this discussion today is the CCS SI, the storage indicator, which tracks the development of storage resources around the world. Now, for this indicator, we've taken a broad range of factors that are core to the developing a commercially viable site for CCS and commercially viable storage resources, some would call capacity. These factors, once again, are assessed through a criteria-based analysis, exactly the same as the previous 3 indicators. But for storage, they include a country's natural geological storage potential, because without that, you can't really have a storage site. We also consider aspects such as the maturity and confidence of published storage resource assessments and how much exploration and appraisal has taken place in the country. And finally, experience in CO2 storage projects and larger facilities, because it's not until a country actually moves towards deploying a CCS project do they realize the barriers in place around CO2 storage itself. Critically, as you'll see in the next slide, we have 12 nations that have mature, that is the band A, or near mature, band B countries that have storage resources matured enough to enable wide-scale CCS deployment. What we can surmise is that these 12 nations are leaders in storage. They're located around the world, and Canada, Norway, USA are seen as band A. They're the leaders, the pure leaders in storage. And then you can see those nations in band B, which I won't go through. The remaining nations either have less well-developed geological storage resources, they have not undertaken the same assessment, or perhaps quite simply they do not have the storage potential compared to the other nations.
And as a non-geologist, I think the critical point that I took away from Chris's report and that is emphasized in this indicator is that there are ample global geological storage resources that will enable CCS to play its full role in meeting our emissions reduction targets. Is that fair, Chris?
Yeah, that's right. So those 12 nations represent well over 3/4 of the world's emissions, and they're not all located in one region. They're all scattered all around the world, which plays strongly for having a global deployment of CCS. One final note I must emphasize here is, once again, India, Russia, and Indonesia scoring quite low in their storage indicators.
So just to reiterate, there are clearly ample opportunities from a storage perspective if we accelerate deployment of CCS. But I'm going to come back to the point that you need regulations in place to enable storage. And so what was interesting is when we compared the results from the LRI to that of the storage indicator, and we noted that there's presently very limited overlap between high-scoring countries within these two indicators. Perhaps, I think it's only Canada and the US which rank very highly in both. And interestingly, both these nations have CCS facilities operating.
Yeah, that's right. Having the storage opportunities in place is not enough. You need the regulations. And that brings us nicely to the final indicator, our CCS Readiness Index.
Yes, the highlight, I think the CCS Readiness Index combines over 70 discrete criteria from our policy, legal and regulatory and storage indicators, and it combines it into a single measure of progress towards deployment of CCS. So
it's the index that brings together all of our knowledge and its data. And the chart that you see in front of you today shows a very general but a positive correlation between CCS Readiness Index and the inherent indicator. And this is actually very positive in the sense of CCS, because it suggests that some nations are actively pursuing the development or in developing an enabling environment for CCS in the context of their emission reduction strategies. And those, namely to the top right of this chart, are well advanced.
And as in addition to the positive trend that we are proposing is found within this particular chart, we can once again identify three significant groups. The leading nations, as we'll call them, again shown in the box on the far right of this chart, they all share very similar characteristics. All have made advances towards CCS deployment. Generally speaking, they have comprehensive regulatory frameworks in place, at least a broad national level understanding of their storage sites, if not a portfolio of sites that is being actively appraised. And I think it's fair to say they all have largely supportive policy environments as well.
And moving on to the next group of nations, the box in the center of this chart, they have almost all the critical enablers for CCS in place. But typically, for the CCS readiness, they score they score lower in one of the specific indicators. So the most in this box, in the center here, it's the policy indicator where the countries score low. Although that's not the case for China, where we know there's a very strong supportive policy, but weak regulatory frameworks for carbon capture and storage.
And again, not to single them out, but the countries that we're highlighting as high opportunity nations, and they're in the box with the exclamation mark included within it. And they are obviously India, Russia, and Indonesia. But really, you could also include a host of other nations just below those three particular countries that we've highlighted. So, for example, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brazil, perhaps Poland.
Yeah, it's a very good point. These nations that Ian just mentioned and the few surrounding it, I think we need to see greater emphasis on CCS development in those countries rather than the deployment of facilities. Obviously, with the development will result in deployment. So that is undertaking the necessary steps to foster a more supportive environment for CCS. Now, with the indicators, we can use this to readily characterize what aspects these countries need to create that more supportive environment. So, for example, we've decided today to look at Brazil. Now, it's a moderately scoring country in this index, around a score of 48. What does it need to do to become a leading country? So we know that it has a CCS facility in the offshore Santos Basin. So they have extensive, and amongst other projects, they have extensive experience in capture and storage of CO2, and they also have substantial storage potential across the country.
So really what you could say here in the case of Brazil is that there are a number of non-technical barriers at play. The policy indicator result for Brazil is relatively low, so we know that they require policy mechanisms to promote and support CCS deployment, and similarly their legal and regulatory score is also quite low, again suggesting that they require review or greater focus upon CCS specific law and regulation.
Yeah, and so each country is different and each country has its strengths and weaknesses towards deployment. We'd like to also finally, within the CCS Readiness Index, highlight one final group.
And this is a very large group of nations which lies squarely in the middle of the Readiness Index, as we've shown within the square in the chart. In fact, this core group of nations is pretty much replicated across many of the other indicators. The majority within this particular group are European nations, but also includes South Africa and several other more developed Southeast Asian nations. While their position here is consistent, we think that there is strong potential for an improvement, which would allow these nations to make significant progress in deployment.
Yeah, so reviewing these nations that lie squarely in the middle, what we have seen is that they actually don't require substantial, or let's say an overhaul of their storage review or their legal and regulatory frameworks. They just need to make small incremental changes to emerge as leaders in carbon capture and storage.
So now the final part of this presentation, we're going to look at some of the other issues allied to these indicators and some of the discussions that we raised at the start of this presentation. And the first here is looking at the historical deployment and our reflections upon future deployment. And this is shown within a chart which we're going to discuss this in relation to a chart which many of you will be familiar with. And this is the Institute's CCS facility bubble chart. When we examine the relationship between CCS deployments, as shown on this chart, and the Readiness Index, what Chris and I were interested in was whether this comparison enables us to identify nations that are likely candidates for future deployment.
Yeah, so let's look at the historical deployment. We have USA, Canada, and Norway. They've dominated the deployment of CCS, as you can see in that bubble chart. The European nations that have deployed are both Norway. And those countries have also scored the highest in the CCS Readiness Indicator. So that's indicative of a strongly supportive environment. And we all know within the CCS world and the broader energy community that these countries have had other commercial drivers for carbon capture and storage, namely enhanced oil recovery, or perhaps the CO2 tax. But what they continue to do now and into the future is continue to improve and refine their regulations. They continue to improve and develop their storage resources. And they also provide the policy environment conducive to CCS.
If we then look forward, we start to see an interesting trend, perhaps with those CCS, with CCS facilities in the construction and development phases. Many of those are also some of the high-ranking nations that we've discussed before, both in the index and across a number of indicators. Here we have Canada and Australia moving forward in the next decade, as well as a number of, a cluster of projects proposed in the UK. I mean, the outlier here, perhaps, Chris, is China.
Yeah, going forward in China, we see significant deployment in the coming decade as well as post 2025. Now, as we said before, China has a very strong policy environment and is very supportive in developing their storage resources. And they also have significant EOR opportunities that afford conditions for deployment. However, an absence of CCS-specific law and regulations could be identified as one of the areas where China could focus its attention to accelerate CCS deployment even further.
Okay, our next slide. And our last few slides now, we're going to look at some of the drivers. So firstly, what are the major drivers for CCS in the future? And the first we're going to posit is the requirement for nations to meet their climate change targets. On the slide in front of you, we have a chart of a chart of various scenarios, and we see that no matter what target, carbon budget, or scenario, I'm speaking very generally here, that is created by climate and technology modelers, CCS is included and is necessary.
Yep, CCS is applied quite aggressively from 2030 in the power generation and industrial sector.
And these scenarios are all based on 2-degree scenarios, or the more ambitious beyond 2 degrees, as identified in the Paris Agreement. And what we are seeing is that when these targets are set, perhaps, or highlighting in particular legislated targets, governments are realizing CCS is critical.
And the United Kingdom is a fantastic example of a legislated target creating the right investment environment for CCS, and indeed the whole clean energy revolution. And what we see are the results. United Kingdom have added the most large-scale facilities of late and become perhaps the most outspoken advocate for CCS.
And of course, this position is reflected in the rise of the UK and their policy indicator score of recently, and their position in the Readiness Index, where the UK, as we mentioned only a few slides back, is positioned as a CCS leader.
And then we have what we call the real game changer and the future driver for carbon capture and storage, reaching that climate goal of temperature stabilization below 1.5 degrees. And this chart shows the scenario pathways from the most recently published IPCC special report called SR 1.5 or SR 15. And what it's done is really put a spotlight on CCS. As you can see from this graph of cumulative CO2 stored between now and 2100. No longer is CCS deployment limited to power industrial sectors. We now have CCS playing a critical role in negative emissions technology. Bioenergy and CCS, and direct air capture and storage. Both of these negative energy technologies are critical to 1.5 degrees, and both of these negative energy technologies use carbon capture and storage.
So really and essentially the key takeaway here is that we need CCS at a truly industrial scale. And this is going to necessitate the injection and storage of gigatons of CO2 per year. And to achieve this, we need to have a comprehensive enabling environment. And that ties us back to some of the discussions we were just having.
So basically, we need high scores across all the indicators and the index.
Yeah, and it makes the findings of those indicators and index all the more important, because we're now talking about a very rapid deployment and at a massive scale. Those leading CCS nations that we've identified across the various indexes and indicators need to be the catalyst for greater deployment, and they also need to perhaps step up and become leaders in knowledge transfer to those lower scoring nations.
And so that brings us nicely to the final slide in the question. Is the world ready for carbon capture and storage? Well, let's first qualify the question. We are only considering the factors incorporated in the indicators, of course. That is in terms of storage, policy, law and regulation. There are a myriad of factors that can influence the deployment of CCS and also the clean energy revolution that we're seeing around the world. But on that, I'm going to answer the question with a non-answer. It really depends how you look at it. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? So the pessimist in me highlights those nations with the highest growth in emissions into the future. These are the regions with some of the lowest CCS Readiness Index scores. Southeast Asia, Central and South America, and Africa. They're poorly represented in the CCS Readiness Index, and basically their action in CCS has been very low. So in those regions, the answer would be no. We are not ready for the global deployment of CCS.
And the optimist in me, taking a very positive note, is that if we are looking at the heightened role for CCS in decarbonising the world, then we should consider the largest emitting industrialised nations. And many of those nations are the high-scoring countries in the CCS Readiness Index. Taking a glasses half full approach, this is indicative of really how much we've achieved to date. There's a lot that's been achieved in some of those countries. So amongst those leaders in CCS, they are ready or indeed near ready for CCS to be deployed at scale, subject to obviously some of the qualifications we've discussed before. So in me answering the question, the answer is yes. In those specific instances, I think we are on track.
And that's quite a positive note to end this discussion. And we hope you like listening to us today. If you'd like more information, the methodology behind the indicators and the index itself is available on our website. And now we'll move on to the Q&A session. So throughout the presentation, we've had many questions be submitted, and we're just curating them now. And we may not be able to get through all of them in the allocated time. If you still have questions, please submit them through the webinar inbox. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website. So now on to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Chris. Lucy's been hard at work pulling all the questions together as they've come through. So just bear with me 1 second. I'm going to pull these together. Okay, first question, Chris, I'm going to ask you. Tricky one. Why is it not being deployed?
It's a tricky question, but it's quite a simple one. No technology is meeting its targets, which is set out by the Paris Agreement and even the more ambitious targets. Well, when you look at the IEA recent technology roadmap, I think there's only electric vehicles that were close to meeting their target. And I think, if I think about it, it's because CO2 still does not have a true cost that is compared to the impacts of climate change. And so no technology is being deployed at the scale or rate required, whether it be hydrogen production, renewable energy, battery deployment, or carbon capture and storage. Okay, so on to the next question. We mentioned the 2016 publication of the CCS Readiness Index. What countries have improved?
Okay, I'll jump in here. There's a lot to sort of consider between the two. I think we've highlighted the UK in particular. We mentioned this in our presentation a minute ago. We've seen a resurgence of their approach to policy. So the UK would obviously be a strong contender here between the two reports, 2016 to 2018. And I think we'll continue to see an improvement here. So I'm looking forward to the next piece of analysis that we do, noting in particular some of the work that's underway in the UK this week. Other countries, the Netherlands, Norway, Japan, I think again, we've seen some more significant policy interventions and announcements in the last 2 years. From my perspective, the legal and regulatory indicator scores haven't really improved in a number of countries, but I think, Chris, if I'm correct in saying, storage has improved some of the assessments for those nations. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The storage overall has improved, which is a good sign in itself. Okay, we've got another question. How can we persuade those who are against carbon capture and storage that it is safe?
Okay, I will jump in here. Let me think. I think I'm going to take a very legalistic perspective on this. I think this is one example of where law and regulation can take a very important role, not only for providing the regulator with certainty or an operator with certainty, but also providing perhaps the public with an opportunity to engage. One of the things we have considered when we were looking at the legal and regulatory indicator was public engagement, or rights of public engagement within CCS-specific legal and regulatory regimes. So that's something we've certainly considered. And you tend to find that in a lot of the planning processes, there are opportunities for public consultation. So clearly there's an opportunity there for demonstrating to the public that they can engage in the process. In terms of persuading the public that it's safe, I'll divert to Chris in a minute to talk about storage, but I will say one of the other opportunities is the liability provisions that are found in CCS-specific legislation, ensuring that there are effectively repercussions for those that breach the expected requirements of storage, both from a punitive element in terms of cost, but also ensuring that there's longevity in regulation. And what you've seen is some very interesting provisions around post-closure liability and ensuring that an operator is held responsible for an effective time limit after the lifetime or life cycle of a CCS project operation. So I've given you a very legal view there. Chris, have you got any views?
Yeah, you've nailed it, really. It comes down to people having knowledge in what they're doing and having repercussions for having international standards in place. So what we know is that CO2 has been injected into the subsurface since 1972. To date, we've probably had over a gigaton of CO2 being injected and stored in the ground. And we haven't had any major accidents, and it's been done safely and securely. The reason is because there's standards. The second reason is because there is monitoring. The oil and gas industry know how to work the subsurface fluids. They've been producing oil and gas for hundreds of years, and CO2 injection is not that dissimilar. More towards CO2 storage on its own, the technology is constantly being refined by those important researchers out there, refining the methodology and understanding the subsurface all that better.
I think just one final point I'd make here is one of the things that we've highlighted perhaps as an organisation is the role of clear and effective public engagement between technical experts. It's all very well, Chris and I sat here as a geologist and as a lawyer who've worked for a long period of time in CCS, and similarly with those working within industry. I think it's also beholden for technical experts to engage the public and talk to them about their concerns, and in a very clear and concise manner explain to them some of the elements of the CCS technological processes that are involved in terms which are perhaps clearer than the sort of technical language that we deal in here.
All right, there's a quick one here. Does the CCS RI incorporate both industrial and the power sector in CCS? It includes everything on carbon capture and storage. So that's a quick answer.
Chris, I'm going to come back to you again. The question on Germany. Germany ranks very highly, sorry, I'm trying to consolidate two questions here on Germany. Germany ranks highly, especially in the storage indicator, yet they have been opposed to CCS. Comments?
Yeah, I guess when you say opposed, that's quite a strong word to use. Let's just say it's a less favourable environment in the policy sector. But what we know over the past decade is that Germany was in fact one of these leaders of carbon capture and storage. They were proactive in the deployment of CCS, historically that is. But recently, this proactive movement has been largely slowed significantly. So Germany's high score is actually attributed to their initial groundwork for CCS that they did undertake. Okay, so we'll be wrapping up soon, but we've still got some really good questions. The contribution of CCS in the deployment scenarios, especially in the IPCC report, is very high. Can you see CCS ever meeting this target?
Right, there's a myriad of things we could address within here. Chris and I have spent a fair bit of time looking at the recent report. In fact, Chris has written a very interesting analysis for our members, which is available on our members portal, looking at the IPCC special report. So there's a bit of a plug there for members to have a quick look at that. I think the one takeaway that I had from the IPCC report is clearly, and I'm going to say there's a mandate now for the rapid deployment of CCS within that report. I think the IPCC is pretty clear that CCS is not only required, but I'm going to say it's almost critical. Negative emissions, Chris, I'll let you jump in here because I know you're itching to.
Yeah, it's important. So let's be clear that negative emissions are still CCS. So they still require the capture, transport, and storage of CO2. That's the BECCS and direct air capture. But let's think about it more holistic and all of the above approach. We need negative emissions to meet that 1.5 degree climate mitigation target. But before that, we need to rapidly deploy CCS on the high emission CO2 sources that are currently pumping out CO2 to avoid the worst of climate change. So can we meet the targets? Well, we've been discussing in this presentation that it's absolutely critical necessary. And one of our mantras here at the Global Institute is that CCS's time is now. So on that note, I'm going to close and hand over to Lucy.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you to everyone for joining this webinar, and especially to all of those participants who submitted questions. Unfortunately, we were not able to get through all the questions in the allocated time. However, if you still have any questions to submit, please do so. You can through the webinar inbox, that is webinar@globalccsinstitute.com, and we'll certainly endeavour to get back to you on all of the topics you've raised this evening. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website along with a copy of the presentation in the coming days. I'd like to thank Ian and Chris for presenting this webinar, and a reminder that all of the publications discussed during the webinar are available to download at our website, globalccsinstitute.com. Lastly, as you're leaving this session today, we've put together a very quick 3-question survey and would appreciate you taking the time to complete it to help us improve our webinar program. Thank you all for your attendance, and goodbye.